When we hear the words concentration camps, most of us immediately think of World War II and the horrors inflicted by the Nazis. But what if I told you that America too harbored its own death camps? This isn't a story about Germany or Europe. No, this is a story about Mississippi, a place where barbarism and death were inflicted not by foreign enemies, but by a country that claimed to offer freedom and liberty. This is the untold tragedy of the Devil's Punch Bowl, a death camp hidden in the heart of America. In the year 1863, as the Civil War raged on, the brutal realities for Black Americans were only getting worse. Despite promises of freedom, 20,000 newly freed slaves were thrown into this deadly pit in Natchez, Mississippi. There, they suffered, they starved, and they died. Their only crime? Trusting that emancipation meant true freedom. It shouldn't shock us that a nation built on centuries of Black oppression created death camps. What's shocking is that we've never heard about it. While the atrocities of German concentration camps are taught in every classroom, the Devil's Punch Bowl is barely whispered about, its horrors almost forgotten. Imagine being freed from slavery, only to be forced into conditions worse than the plantations. In the North, Black Americans faced rampant discrimination, segregated schools, no jobs, no rights, no hope. In the South, they were promised peace, but instead found themselves trapped in a nightmare. The very people they once trusted with their future became the instruments of their torment. The Emancipation Proclamation, a decree that was supposed to bring freedom, was nothing more than a cruel illusion. It was a promise made by Abraham Lincoln, but for many Black men and women, it was just another betrayal in a long line of broken promises. The same hatred that had shackled their ancestors' wrists now shackled their future. This is a history most of us were never taught. A history that reveals America's darkest depths, a place where forgiveness may never be found. In this video, we are unmasking that hidden past, a past so painful, you'll wonder how it was kept in the shadows for so long. Before we delve deeper into this harrowing chapter, do us a favor. Hit that thumbs up, share this video with your friends and family, and help us spread this important story of Black history. The truth needs to be told, and your support makes that possible. Now, let's begin. Somewhere in the quiet foothills of Mississippi, the trees hang heavy with peaches, ripe, full, and untouched. You might wonder why such a bounty remains uneaten. Legend has it that these peaches grow from soil soaked in the blood of the dead. The Devil's Punch Bowl, a place riddled with stories of pirates and plane crashes, holds a far darker secret, one not of treasure, but of horror, hatred, and the mass suffering of Black Americans. One particularly haunting chapter from the Civil War tells the story of newly freed Black Americans who fled to Mississippi, hoping for safety but finding nothing but cruelty. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, meant to free slaves in rebel states, was supposed to be their deliverance. Later, the 13th Amendment promised the end of slavery across the entire nation. But promises on paper were not promises kept. Freedom, as many Black Americans soon realized, was a cruel illusion. Why did Abraham Lincoln, a man who would later be hailed as the Great Emancipator, suddenly call for the end of slavery? Was this the same America that had treated its Black population with unrelenting hatred? What caused this change of heart? Let's unravel the mystery. On April 12, 1861, the American Civil War broke out. It was a devastating conflict that tore the nation apart, and despite the Union's larger population, they found themselves struggling. The Confederacy, made up of 11 southern states, fought fiercely to maintain their way of life, a way of life built on the backs of enslaved Black people. The North, or Union, consisted of 22 states with a total population of around 31.4 million. By 1860, roughly 3.8 million men were serving in the military, but the war was a massacre. 620,000 lives lost, nearly 2% of the entire nation. Lincoln knew his Union Army was facing disaster. He needed more manpower to win the war, and he saw an opportunity, an untapped source of strength: the enslaved black population. Lincoln's plan was both strategic and revolutionary. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued on January 1, 1863, wasn't just a moral statement. It was a calculated move to rally enslaved black people to fight for the Union. And it worked. Thousands of black men, women, and children, lured by the promise of freedom, joined the Union's cause. They fought valiantly, risking their lives for a future where equality would be the norm, where the color of their skin wouldn't condemn them to a life of suffering. But when the dust settled and the war was won, the reality was much harsher than their dreams. America wasn't ready for them. The Reconstruction era, from 1866 to 1877, aimed to rebuild the South and figure out how black and white Americans could live together in a society without slavery. But this fragile peace was shattered time and again. The same nation they had fought to save was still unwilling to embrace them fully as citizens. And it was in places like the Devil's Punch Bowl that the horrors of this unfinished revolution played out most brutally. The South saw Reconstruction not as an opportunity for healing, but as a bitter, humiliating punishment. The former Confederate states had no interest in welcoming change, especially not for the newly freed black population. For those who had only recently tasted freedom, the challenges seemed never-ending. Stripped of education and resources, many former slaves found themselves trapped in a cruel system known as sharecropping, where they rented land from their former masters only to give up a significant portion of their crops as payment. It was a cruel irony. The chains of slavery may have been broken, but the shackles of poverty and dependence remained. In addition to this, the violence against black Americans showed no signs of slowing down. Starvation, segregation, and brutal beatings were part of daily life, and lynchings became the ultimate act of terror meant to subjugate them. Even though slavery had technically ended, the horrors continued under a different name. To make matters worse, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 still cast a long shadow, forcing free blacks to constantly live in fear. This law allowed slave catchers to hunt down freed African Americans and drag them back into the grip of slavery, erasing the progress of emancipation in a heartbeat. In desperation, nearly 110,000 freed black men, women, and children began a massive exodus, fleeing the North in search of a place where they could truly start over. Many traveled through Natchez, Mississippi, hoping for safety and refuge, but what they found was far worse than they could have ever imagined. By 1860, Natchez was a city of stark contrasts, home to a population of just over 6,600 people, including 2,132 freed slaves and 208 free blacks. But by 1870, the city's black population had surged to over 5,300, while the white population had dwindled. Tensions ran high, as the whites of Natchez resented the fact that those who had once been their property were now free. Fearful and angry, the city's residents turned to the Union troops, who were still stationed there after the Civil War. Together, they devised a merciless solution to their black problem, the Devil's Punch Bowl. The Devil's Punch Bowl, a naturally formed bowl-like enclosure near the Mississippi River, was about to become a living nightmare. With towering trees casting shadows from the bluffs above, this pit was chosen as the perfect location to imprison the freed slaves. Union soldiers saw it as a convenient place to gather up these newly liberated black men, women, and children and wall them in with no hope of escape. Historian Don Estes, former director of the Natchez City Cemetery, described it as yet another kind of concentration camp. The Devil's Punch Bowl became a prison for the very people who had just won their freedom. This death camp housed 3 separate encampments, all designed to contain the freed black population under horrific conditions. The men were subjected to backbreaking labor, forced to work in unimaginable conditions. But the women and children were left behind in the camp, malnourished, dehydrated, and struggling to survive. With little to no access to food or water, many succumbed to the elements, and others fell victim to disease. Smallpox spread like wildfire, ravaging the camp and claiming countless lives. The suffering these people endured was incomprehensible. For many, the Devil's Punch Bowl was far worse than the very plantations they had escaped. Experts estimate that in just a single year, over 20,000 freed black men, women, and children perished in the Devil's Punch Bowl. The death toll was staggering, a number so high that it seems almost incomprehensible. The conditions were so unbearable that prisoners, many on the brink of death, begged the Union troops to return to the plantations they had fled. But their cries for mercy fell on deaf ears. Historian and paranormal researcher Paula Westbrook paints a grim picture of what happened next. The army showed no compassion, not even in death. They didn't allow the survivors to remove the bodies of the fallen from the camp. Instead, they handed them shovels and ordered them to bury their loved ones right where they lay. But these men and women, weakened from relentless suffering, were too feeble to dig proper graves. The bodies decomposed in shallow pits, breeding disease and creating a vicious cycle of death. This horrific chapter, like so many others in American history, has been buried deep under layers of denial and silence. Yet it speaks to a larger truth about the United States' long and terrible history of racially motivated atrocities. As James Baldwin so powerfully said in 1963, American history is longer, larger, more varied, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it. One notable figure who documented the atrocities of the Devil's Punch Bowl was James E. Yateman, a philanthropist with the Western Sanitary Commission. In November of 1863, he visited the camp and wrote an urgent appeal to President Lincoln, describing the unimaginable suffering he had witnessed. 75 died in a single day, he reported. Some returned to their masters on account of their suffering. Despite the punishing labor they were forced to endure, death was a constant companion in the camp. The Union soldiers showed no remorse. At least 20,000 lives were extinguished in that pit, and not a single one of them had the chance to escape. The dead were buried where they dropped, their bodies mingling with the earth as a permanent, tragic reminder of this forgotten genocide. As Westbrook lamented, those who had once dreamed of building a new life away from the master's whip found themselves trapped in yet another form of bondage. The promise of freedom was a cruel mirage. They never had the chance to build businesses, accumulate wealth, or pass anything of value to their children. They never experienced the happiness or freedom that should have been theirs. Today, the Mississippi River occasionally floods, bringing skeletal remains to the surface, silent witnesses to the horrors that once unfolded there. These bones are proof of the unspeakable atrocities committed at the Devil's Punch Bowl, and a reminder that history cannot be erased, no matter how hard we try to bury it. Even the land itself seems haunted. The wild peach trees that grow in the area produce fruit that no one dares to eat. Though the peaches are large and plentiful, the locals avoid them, knowing they are nourished by the remains of innocent men, women, and children. It's a macabre reminder of the horrors carried out by their ancestors, an evil that cannot be forgotten or consumed. In light of this dark history, the call for reparations for Black Americans seems more urgent than ever. While no amount of money or apologies could ever right these wrongs, acknowledging the depth of the injustice is a start. The systemic hatred against Black people is clear, stretching from the atrocities of the 1800s to the injustices of today. This truth is echoed in Billie Holiday's haunting song, Strange Fruit, where she sings about the bodies of Black men and women hanging from trees like the bitter fruit of America's racial violence. It's why Black people continue to face overrepresentation in prisons, why legislation aimed at advancing Black communities is slow to pass, and why even the smallest steps forward are often met with what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called white backlash. The painful reality is that Black Americans were never intended to be part of the American dream. They were never meant to own land, become political leaders, or contribute to society in any meaningful way. To the Confederate States, they were merely property, valuable only as labor or collateral. This is why the South fought so hard to preserve the institution of slavery, and why so many Black Americans continue to fight for their rightful place in a country that was never built with them in mind. The grim reality of the Devil's Punch Bowl and countless other camps like it serves as a harsh reminder of the unimaginable horrors that freed Black Americans continued to face, even after the abolition of slavery. Abigail Cooper, an assistant professor of history, has studied the experiences of African Americans in refugee camps during the Civil War. More than 200 camps were established during that time, with over 800,000 Black Americans passing through them. These camps became places of monumental transformation for Black people. It was during this time that the Black community began to view America not just as the land of their oppression, but as their home. But the reality of the camps was far from what they had envisioned. Conditions were dire, disease was rampant, and fear of attacks by white Southerners loomed over the camps. While some white refugees also sought shelter in these camps, they were treated differently. They were given more rations and received better care than the Black refugees. Despite this disparity, these camps still represented a sanctuary of sorts. They were spaces where freed Black people for the first time could try to imagine what it might feel like to truly be free. Free from the grip of another's ownership, free from the constant threat of the whip. It was here that many families reunited after years of brutal separation. People from various cultures and backgrounds came together, forming makeshift communities. In some of these camps, access to education was possible, a glimpse of hope for a brighter future. A pair of shoes became a symbol of freedom for many. During slavery, enslavers would often lock away shoes at night to prevent escapes. For those making the perilous journey to the camps, having shoes was essential. They were often the difference between freedom and capture, as it was easy to spot an escapee who was barefoot. Some refugees even crafted makeshift shoes from plantain leaves, the strong scent masking their trail from the bloodhounds that hunted them. The road to freedom, however, was long, dangerous, and often deadly. Racial terror and lawlessness reigned, and many Black men, women, and children were brutally attacked, injured, or killed during their journey. These retaliatory killings often went undocumented, but their effects rippled through the Black community, leaving scars that would endure for generations. Remembering the Devil's Punch Bowl is not easy, but it is necessary. It forces us to confront a dark and painful chapter of American history, one that cannot be forgotten. The suffering of those who were imprisoned, starved, and forced into unimaginable labor in that cursed encampment is a brutal reminder of the horrors of racial oppression. Their story stands as a testament to the long and difficult struggle for freedom and equality. As we reflect on these harrowing events, we are reminded of the timeless words of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. "Injustice anywhere hurts justice everywhere." We are all connected, and the suffering of one affects us all. This should serve as a call to not only acknowledge the past, but to actively work towards justice. We must strive to build a future where every person is treated with dignity, respect, and equality. And with that, we come to the end of another enlightening video. We encourage you to like, share, and join the conversation in the comment section. We always look forward to hearing your thoughts. If you found value in this content, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us as we continue to uncover important stories from history. Thank you for watching.